Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode number 6 of the Trialogues podcast. This is where we like to talk about real estate, marketing, strategy, and leadership while eating lots of avocado sandwiches and attempt to get on the leaderboard of the Avocado Sandwich Forum. My name is Robert Hahn. I am the managing partner of 7DS Associates, and I'm a blogger, speaker, and general discussion haver. And with me, as always, are my two compadres, Matthew and Gaylord. Matthew, are you there?
Yes. Hello, Rob. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Matthew Shadwell. I'm the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group, New York's largest residential real estate brokerage. I do some writing for Retso, and I'm involved in the anything digital that touches the customer here, across 2,000 agents spread out across New York City, the Hamptons, and the Palm Beach area of South Florida.
And I'm Gaylord DeWald. I'm president and janitor of Thought Faucet, and I'm based out of Burlington, Vermont, and I do consulting for real estate as well as several other industries in marketing, technology, strategy work in particular.
Right on. And, of course, as always, having to put up with us on a weekly basis and fiddling the dials and buttons, behind the virtual glass of producer, Lindsay Planetta, who writes at ocrealestatevoice.com. She is a broker, agent, and coach out in Orange County, California. So, gentlemen, here we are again. We've now had a couple of weeks of our podcast kind of being out there, and, the response has been kind of nice so far, right?
Yeah, things are going well. I think the reception has been very warm in places and generally favorable. So it's nice to hear that our conversations are resonating with people. That's always awesome to
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah, and we scored a 4-star rating in the iTunes podcast thing, so we finally got enough people to rate us.
4 stars. What happened to 5 stars?
Yeah, there's always someone in there who doesn't like you. It's you. It's typically Rob.
We probably dropped a star because of the weather, right?
That's what I'm thinking. It's the weather.
Talking about the weather.
Oh, they don't like avocados.
It could be avocados. It could be Subway. Decide to take us out. I mean,
that's cool. I say 4 is good. The missing star is the exception that proves the rule.
So, listen, I know in our show prep, we decided we're going to talk about something that I'm kind of obsessed about at the moment, and Gaylord is actually kind of an expert on, and it's this whole notion of, the topic of big data, right? It's something I ran across. I've kind of heard about it, known about it for a couple of years, but I ran across this video of a guy from BCG, Boston Consulting Group, at some conference talking about the implications of big data for the corporation. And I got fascinated with it, and I put up a couple of blog posts about it. But I thought, for our audience, for the few who might be interested in this topic, my thought was, why don't we just start with kind of just general kind of what is big data? What does all this stuff mean? And I know, Gaylord, this is an area that's right up your alley. So, start us off. What is all this stuff?
Yeah, so I love talking about big data, of course. So the first thing, I guess, to start off with on it is like, what is big data, right? Everyone's like going around talking about it. What is it? And there isn't like an official term. Like, it's not like that there's a real, like a ISO spec or whatever that says this is big data and that's small data. So the generally accepted meaning of it is just anything that's got enough volume and scale and velocity that it's not going to work on your desktop computer alone. So you need some kind of server farm or something cooking it up and dealing with it. And there's 2 things to look at. Like when they say big, there's 2 important aspects of it. One is, what's the size of the existing pile of data? How many different, if it were a traditional database, how many different records are in it? Or if it, if it's a table thing, how many different, tables and rows. And then the other one is, how fast is it coming in? How quickly is this data amassing? Because either one of those can cause you trouble with hardware. But ultimately, I think that the whole phrase big data in some ways it's kind of a marketing gimmick, right? We couldn't get anybody to pay attention to data in the first place, like back when everyone started talking about like I'm going to have a data-driven business, and everyone thought that was going to be great. And Amazon and Walmart did it, and everyone listened to conference speakers talk about it, but no one actually wanted to commit to doing anything with data. So, well, if data didn't work, right? Let's just call it big data. And so now it's big and important. Right. So in some ways, it's like a marketing thing. It's how different is it from regular data? It's got some differences, but in reality, not so much. Like, okay, we can sell some hardware now. So that's part of what's going on at the root level of what is big data. The other thing, there's two other sort of concepts, I guess, that are worth keeping in mind. Beyond scale and velocity, is the idea of this horizontal or vertical. So whether you're talking about drilling down deeply and gathering every facet of a particular kind of customer or transaction, or whether you're looking across different data sets and trying to marry and match them together. And it's that looking across different data sets that's more interesting in a big data sense, because you're starting to take, previously large databases and then trying to match them together. That's kind of the secret sauce behind the whole idea of the social graph, to understand a human being in terms of all their different relationships and what those relationships mean and stuff like that. But that's like a big force within the big data world, which leads to really ugly, messy data as people try to join up these different databases.
So
is that helpful or more confusing, Rob?
I mean, I think it's a really helpful summation, but I guess I want to sort of key off of your initial thought, which is this is just a marketing gimmick. And I guess that's my first question is, obviously I'm somewhat newer to this than you are, Gaylord, but
sure.
Is this really just hype? I mean, or is there actual real value to this whole notion of big data?
Yeah, there's some value to it. But the thing is, as with any kind of data initiative, it depends on the culture of the organization that's deploying it, right? Like you can have a giant database, you can have, zettabytes and exabytes or whatever of data, but if your organization isn't going to do anything with it, who cares? And there are some issues with, in some cases, there are some issues with how the data is created and managed and put together, and in many ways, whether it has meaning or not depends a great deal on the initiative and leadership of the people getting it. And I'll take an example here. So in the hard sciences like DNA research, right? They've been dealing with big data for a very long time, and it's not that big a deal to them. It's just like, okay, whatever. But in the hard sciences, the physical world always responds the same, no matter how you query it or experiment with it. Like, something has a certain mass, it's going to continue to have a certain mass, and if it changes, that's a pretty weird situation. A lot of the big data initiatives in marketing are dealing with data about human beings. And human beings aren't consistently the same from one day to the next. As we know, like fashion and taste and, all of those things change on a regular basis, or worse, on an irregular basis. So some of is this data worth anything or not? It's kind of like, is a visitor to your website the same today, the same as a visitor to your website tomorrow? Is the value of someone coming to your website the same as it was 5 years ago? And so that's like, does it have any value or not? Those are it's kind of tied up to this issue of human beings change, and a lot of the big data initiatives are focused around understanding human behavior, which is it's not as cut and dried as people who would like to sell you software and consulting gigs might suggest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really interesting trend to try and increasingly look at these kinds of things at the 50,000 foot, 100,000 foot view level. And when you were talking about sort of like horizontal and vertical, the way that we've been thinking about it in my marketing world is that what is referred to as big data, and you could just call that just large volume of data, is that it allows you to see see trends and types of behavior in perhaps new and insightful ways that you wouldn't have where if you're looking at smaller pools of data, and especially if you start grouping together groups of information. And I think that is very interesting to a marketing organization or brokerage or anybody interested in trying to understand predictive modeling and analyze future trends, is because it allows you to see things that you may not have seen before. But when you're talking about all this understanding of human behavior and ways to sort of interpret and analyze those things, I think that one of the big issues with this stuff is that it still ultimately kind of boils down to knowing what kind of question to ask of the data, and having an understanding of like, well, what do we really want to extract from this? And if we take it to like a sort of logical conclusion, say we have access to all data, as broad and as vague and as unlikely as that is, where we have access to everything that we would possibly want access to, we still are faced as people with what do I need to extract from that? What do I want to see? Can I even see it? And I think one of the interesting things that I see in the big data discussions is that it's increasingly becoming limited by the human interaction with the data rather than the data itself. Like the solving of all the data problems and the implementation stuff and the joining of the different disparate databases that you're talking about is somewhat of a temporary problem, but that in the immediate future sort of gets resolved cumulatively. But you still come back to sort of like the flashing cursor in the search box that says, well, what do you want to do with all this stuff? And that's really the more interesting thing for me in the big data discussion. It's not necessarily the implementation stuff, but like what do you do with it?
The thing is, Matthew, I mean, I guess from my standpoint, it's both in a way, right? In other words, even in our quote small data world, right? I mean, data itself doesn't tell you anything. The important thing is not the data. The important thing is actionable information, right? It's actionable intelligence.
Right. Insight. What is
insight? That's exactly it.
Insight is the word, that's typically used.
Yeah, and I feel like that problem is never going to go away, whether it's small data or big data. It doesn't matter whether I have a table of 500, people or a table of 50 billion. I mean, it really doesn't matter. All I have is data, and the issue of human insight, sort of trying to analyze, understand that stuff, and actually coming up with something, something smart to do as a result of that. I think that's a problem that's never going to go away, whether we're talking about big data or small data or, I guess if there's no data, then there's, nothing to analyze.
In many ways, it's worse. I think it's worse with big data, with something like that.
Okay.
The scale of things that you have to look at is a lot more complex.
Yeah, it's almost like you think about it as a writer, like some people, when they're faced with a blank page, have a hard time making a decision, and big data is just a bigger blank page for a lot of people. They don't know where to go with it. And sometimes, like the problem being that since it's a marketing term du jour, the idea of everyone has to get on and doing something with big data, and it really is like it requires cultural change within an organization to accept and work with the idea of data and with the fuzziness and ugliness of it too. It's not like this stuff, especially when you get like predictive analytics and stuff like that. It's like, okay, like that, is there value in it? Absolutely, but is it really going to tell you anything more than the weatherman did? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I look at it is it's twofold problem. In other words, accepting the fact that human insight is always going to be an issue, right? And no matter what we're talking, whether we're talking about marketing or the freaking NSA, right? I mean, you have analysts for a reason, because you could have access to every single cell phone, call made in the entire world. But if you don't have some human being that's able to listen to a clip and go, yeah, you know what, they're planning on, attacking London next week. If you can't make that judgment, right, then it's useless. All the data in the world is not going to help. And just simply having the data does not mean that you will automatically reach that conclusion, right? I mean, you still need skilled people, who kind of know how to interpret the numbers and have experience and know what it means and do that. At the same time, the thing that's fascinating for me is the idea that big data could provide new capabilities, new tools to that analyst. In other words, so I totally agree with what you guys are saying. The question I have is, let's assume for the time being that there is an organization that is culturally, predisposed that way, that has, really smart, insightful people that could look at data sets and, come up with actionable intelligence. If you handed that organization big data, is that an advantage? And it seems to me the answer has to be yes, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, the closest example that we have in my world here in New York City is what Foursquare are doing. They have, billions of check-ins, every year across millions and millions of users, paired with location data, paired with photos, paired with, rich media type content like that. And they have, massive data sets about people's movements in the world. And, what they're doing is that they're, just little by little, there's no grand step here, but what they're starting to do is solve problems that people have when they make decisions about going somewhere. And one of the latest updates that I thought was really, really interesting that they added in was that they're starting to surface recommendations for what to do nearby based on the weather. So if it's raining, they're going to surface a different set of locations and things to do as opposed to, if it's a nice sunny day. And I thought that that's like a really, really sort of interesting sort of practical application of big data. It's not, the world's most earth-shattering service, but it actually solves like a real problem when it rains.
Right.
Well, where am I going to go? And they're also starting to surface those things by time of day as well. Very often we think about, like, in our world, in the real estate industry, we think of neighborhood advice as like a fairly evergreen thing. So we could characterize that as like, when you go to this restaurant, you order this meal. But what Foursquare is starting to do is surface that type of recommendation based on time of day. So if your piece of local information is about breakfast, that doesn't appear in the evening. And it's just, they're using that kind of data analysis and insight to drive people's behavior to be more relevant to what's actually going on in the world as opposed to their own lives. And I think that that's really, really interesting sort of combination of all these data sets to actually solve real world problems.
Right. And I think that's exactly what I find fascinating, which is, and I think I might have cited this in my second post, is the challenge for marketers, right? Everywhere throughout all of time, right, is how do you make the right offer at the right time to the right person? Because if you can hit all three of those things, you're going to have a sale, right? Somebody who is really thirsty right now, right, and is being offered some water for the right price, they're going to buy that water. It's things like that. And the challenge for marketing, as we know, is always trying to figure out when is the right time, who is the right person, what is the right offer, right, to get them to do something, to get them to, buy your stuff, whatever that is. So it just felt like, and the first thing I guess I wanted to establish, was that in fact, despite the hype, despite some of the shortfalls, despite some of the dangers, there is in fact some value to this notion of marrying big data capabilities to, smart analytics. Precisely for the types of predictive analytics or decision, making assistance that you're talking about, Matthew, the Foursquare, some of the things. And Gaylord, I know you've been into predictive analytics for a really long time. I'm just imagining that those things can only be helped by the advent of big data. I mean, is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, they can. I mean, obviously, dumping more data into the system, you would assume that it would improve the ability of the system. But it's not necessarily hand in hand. And I should note, like, I'm not saying don't do big data or don't do analytics. That's not the way I feel about it. But just to be aware that sometimes, like the Foursquare example is a nice, smart one, right? Like, we take some human insight about people don't eat breakfast at night, and then we have our big data in this instance is our current collection of tips. and we do a little analysis and we figure out which ones are about breakfast and we don't show them at night. That's a great marrying of two different pieces of information: time of day that the person is accessing and giant pile of recommendations. And weather's a good one. Weather's a classic one also in real estate, right? So when it's raining and you're running an AdWords campaign for your website, when it's raining, you might want to have a higher budget because people are less likely to drive around in the rain and look for houses. So these weather-related ones are classic ones. And the nice thing is that since there's lots of weather stations, the data is accessible. Like you can get at weather data fairly easily to automate some of these things, like decision automation, which I think it's not necessarily a good idea in all circumstances, but it's worth it. But the other thing to look at is if regular data is good, then big data must be better. Like that mindset can lead to more hassle than not, because again, it's not easy to maintain large volumes of data. It's not easy to clean it. It's not easy to keep it secure if you're an industry that requires security for your data. And in many cases, like, well, how much more data did you need to realize that people don't want to hear about breakfast at night? You probably didn't need a ton of it to get there, right? So sometimes it's like some people can't make a decision. Some people are in leadership positions and they're not good at making decisions. I don't know how they got there, but we've all encountered these people before in our lives.
Right.
And for some reason, we suspect that if we just give them more data, they're going to be better at making decisions. But the other side of big data is like, when's it big enough? And we could talk about statistical levels of confidence and all this other stuff, but at some point, it's like, oh, well, we need to get more data. And in the strategy world where, like the Jonathan Boyd junkies like myself, where we have the observe, orient, decide, act, OODA loop thing, we've got a description for what happens when people get addicted to this. It's called the OO loop, right? You observe and orient, and you just constantly observe and orient, and you never make a decision. So at some level, the fact that you could theoretically have all of the data may encourage your decision maker to put off making the decision until they have all the data, even though we're talking at some level you're going to get diminishing returns. And I'm just bringing that up as a counterpoint to weigh on it. I do think big data is awesome. I love predictive analytics and all that, but I think that there needs to be some sanity with that as well.
It's an interesting thing
Go ahead.
It's an interesting thing that as it relates to decision making, Gaylord, because Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about this. He, for good or bad, and whether you take your pop psychology from him or not, he tells an interesting story about the use of this kind of stuff. He says one of the things that comes with the having too much information, being too informed about something, is that it leads to overconfidence and to the point where you start to make mistakes in your decision making, that you actually have so much information and you feel so informed that it leads to sort of an overconfidence and an arrogance. And he actually recounts many sort of interesting stories from military history of generals that knew the lay of the land and they thought they knew exactly where the army was, and he actually sort of recounts a story from the Civil War where a general sent a balloon up across the river, and he knew the exact movements of the troops right before they flanked him and wiped out his army. And
right.
And it's sort of like a really, really interesting thing about what happens to decision making when you have what you think is all the data. And because what happens is that you actually stop having that level of insight, and you start making decisions that are actually incorrect. And Gladwell ends up concluding that this is one of the contributing factors that led to the financial crisis, which is sort of an interesting place to take that.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And he's like an interesting guy to read on that particular topic, and I think that's sort of like the logical conclusion of where something like big data goes. Like Gaylord says, how much is enough? And it seems to me that the more appropriate conversation is like, what is the right data, as opposed to just the size of it or the volume of it or the scale of it. We need the right type of data, which could be a lot smaller. I mean, this applies to so many things that we see, when we use the web. It's not, the size of your followers on Facebook. It's the right followers. It's not the size of your web audience. It's the right audience. Yeah, things like that. So, it's like a fascinating topic, and one of the things that I think we're going to see is a lot more of this. To your earlier point, Rob, much more of this in the real estate industry, as more data starts to become sort of assimilated and assembled by folks like Zillow or Trulia, and they're amassing massive pools of what they think is consumer data. The ability to potentially predictively model, trends and recovery data, and some kind of foresight into the future of the market, starts to become a little bit more of a reality with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that like you brought up with particularly with Malcolm Gladwell, and I think also relates to anybody I think that's new to using this stuff, is this idea of humility. Like that's really the difference between approaching the physical world, like the hard sciences approach to data, where the world is always the world, versus approaching people and human behavior and maintaining some kind of humility about the fact that this is data, but that doesn't make it perfect, and it doesn't, just maintaining some knowledge that the stuff we're looking at could change and it's not perfect. But a lot of times people will look at data, and as soon as you turn something into a number, then suddenly it's this fact, which may or may not be true, and people come with their own kind of predispositions about what any of the numbers mean. I mean, even with regular old data, like you'll look at your Google dashboard and you'll see your bounce rate is 2.79%, and that level of specificity makes it sound like it's like some perfect number, but it just isn't. So that is it's just like one of the basics there is, as you're doing any of this stuff, if it deals with human behavior, to have a certain level of humility. Anybody still here?
I'm here, Gaylord.
All right.
I'm here.
Did we just lose
everyone? I think we lost technical difficulty.
We'll have to cover this one in the edit, Lindsay.
Yep.
We'll just insert some of the Hulk from the Avengers.
Yeah, that's good stuff, man.
This is funny. I wonder if Rob's still talking to himself.
And another thing
what happened?
that I wrote a blog post about, and then I just raised the blog group, and nobody. I got like 70 comments, and what occurs to me is that we're all fucked. He's probably still on the call. Now I feel it.
Yeah.
Well, shit, this has never happened before. That's scary.
Okay, hello? Can you hear me now?
Hey, Rob.
All right.
That's
so I heard you all making jokes at my expense and that,
I think
it's got to be a big edit.
It could have been a lot worse there, Rob,
Yeah, where do we leave off?
I don't know.
We're talking about humility.
Yeah.
Humility. Okay, no, I got it. Okay, hold on. So a little bit of silence. Okay, I think that's all, exactly on point, Gaylord, and, when you're dealing with human beings, especially in a decision-making capacity, I mean, there's no doubt you got to have some humility. You got to have some appreciation for just inherent chaos and irrationality, right? That's just human nature. But I kind of wanted to ask you a slightly different question, and it's this. What I can't really get a sense of, and maybe, tell me what your thoughts are on this. I mean, how cutting edge is this stuff? In other words, if I, for whatever reason, I decided that 7DS Technologies, needs some big data capability, I want to go and put a Craigslist ad up. I mean, is the kind of talent, the engineering to computing science talent to do this sort of thing, is this, sort of commonplace? Is this just an adaptation of existing stuff, or is this like really cutting edge? I mean, that's like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, you're looking at a couple different things. One is all the technical stuff to deal with big data and statistics of that nature has been going on since the 60s in the hard sciences. So chances are good you're going to find a number of people trained in the hard sciences for that. In a business sense, you're dealing with the same issues that you get with finding any kind of insightful analyst, and that is someone who understands your business topic domain, as well as understanding data and numbers and what to trust and not trust. And those two skills aren't often associated with each other. So to some degree, in business, we're facing now the same thing we faced when just regular web analytics and digital analytics was getting off the ground, where you'd have a whole group of people with technical skill sets, like how to set up the hardware and how to, set up, work the databases and that kind of thing. And those were technicians, and they were initially very expensive, and then their skills were outsourced. But the analysts, today you're finding that some of these skill sets still mixed in, where an analyst may have some of these technical skills, and ultimately the analysts will have some technical skills. As far as like cutting edgeness in computer sciences, no, because all those problems were solved many years ago by the hard sciences. And there's even some great, and as a result, there's a lot of great software available for handling this stuff. But your challenge is finding someone who understands the topic domain, understands numbers and analytics, and is willing to work for your organization. That's the big kind of three-way prong kind of system. You could expect to pay a lot of money to hire someone like that, sure, but it's not like they don't exist. It's not like there's 4 in the world, but you're definitely looking at more trouble to hire than a lead PHP developer or something like that.
Well, that's what I was curious about. In other words, like all of this, we're going to relate it back to real estate industry in some way. What I'm wondering is, okay, so I'm seeing all these terms like Hadoop. I just learned that for the first day. Right?
Yeah, that's just a piece of technology. All the things that are just pieces of technology, yes, they'll be expensive, but they're not the real problem. The real problem is at the analysis and insight, and the bigger problem is at the leadership layer. Do decision makers have the skills required to make decisions that make use of these insights? And that's I think the problem isn't finding the analysts. I think that it'll be easier to find the analyst than it will be to find a business leader who can deal.
Yeah,
no doubt about it.
I absolutely agree. And in many ways, like if you're a brokerage that's forging relationships with people that have big data, whether that's a large site like a syndication portal or a big media outlet, or somebody that deals in like real-time data at scale over time, this really, to your point, Gaylord, it only really comes down to the kind of question that you would want to ask of your rep from that organization. You say, I want to do this. I want to do it with you. Can you help me figure out the best way to do it? And then they go work with their respective analysts at those media organizations, and they come back and advise you. It's not even necessarily that it needs to be in-house, but it does need to be somewhat in place with the people that you work with, I think.
I think it's got to be a mix there. Because once you're, and I learned this one by getting in an argument over strategy with Rob a couple of years ago, but for it to be a strategic advantage, your competitor can't go talk to the same data source and just start copying wholesale. And so, and again, I think to some degree that's unlikely because your competitor then is going to have good questions to ask. But I think I would lean more towards in-house, or as much as possible, understanding that it will never all be in-house. The front end of where is that data being gathered is going to be like at the Foursquare interface, and it's not going to be in the Corcoran app interface, And but the greater amount of access to the data, whether it's through an API or some kind of direct feed into the data that you can then process in a meaningful way, then you start to look at a strategic advantage that's very difficult for a competitor to mimic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Here's the thing, guys. So, I mean, I actually think the issue of capability and timing is critical in this sense, right? And I think back to, sort of the introductions, I suppose, of, quote, new technology, right? So the first .com era, when the Internet first came about, and it almost felt like there were certain companies that were able to get the engineering talent who really knew this stuff, right? And it took 10 years for, the technology to become widespread enough where something like finding a PHP developer wasn't going to cost you an arm and a leg, and, right, that these weren't like rare creatures in the wild. And it then becomes commoditized and outsourced. I mean, I totally agree with what Gaylord's saying in terms of the flow of technology just as pieces. But from a business standpoint, in the meantime, while you have that advantage, that's a pretty big deal, right? And I guess what I'm wondering, and this relates almost directly to what you were talking about, Matthew, and it also relates directly to how I opened the show with talking about Philip Evans and this whole idea of big data and the firm, is it seems to me that if this technology, even though it's just plumbing, even though it's just different types of hardware and how to set up different types of databases and different types of hardware, it still feels like it's not that commonplace, yet, such that the organizations and companies who have those people have certain advantages, at least from a capability standpoint, right? It doesn't answer the analyst question,
right,
and it certainly doesn't deal with the business leader issue, right? So here's the thing: if that is true, and we're looking at a typical, let's call it a 10-year cycle, because I feel like it took about 10 years, before HTML and CSS and some of these things became somewhat commonplace, and you could just go to some random outsourcing solution to have them build your website. I mean, if we're talking, it's about 10 years, and there's inherent value, or there's value that could be derived from having something like big data, it does raise the question of what happens in that 10-year period. Right? And Matthew, so let's kind of go into that. First of all, I think the assumptions are the following, right, in sort of the discussion today. The assumptions are big data poses a lot of dangers because you can make you overconfident, and just having a giant database is not going to somehow catapult your business to the forefront, because you need things like smart business leadership who can make decisions, and you need smart analysts who could sort of dig up actionable intelligence out of these ginormous horizontal data sets. That's all true. At the same time, if you have that capability, that is something that other folks are going to find difficult to acquire in the short term, because it's expensive. It's not as common as a PHP developer. So that naturally then tends to, in my opinion, concentrate power in the hands of those companies that have it. Right?
Yeah, I want to interrupt on that. So I got to interrupt on that. So, and this was what I'm about to say was also true in the early days of the web. So there's two ways that you can motivate the kind of individual that we're talking about. One of them is with money, and that's a very valuable and useful way to motivate someone. But another one is by giving them an interesting problem to solve. A lot of the best PHP coders and the lead developers, and if you talk to anybody in the software industry that's had to lead a team of developers, they'll nod along in agreement. The best ones are there because they are truly interested in the problems that they're solving. And the same thing goes for analysts, right? If they're able to work with a sufficiently interesting and useful pile of data and tease out sufficiently interesting and useful insights, then yes, you're going to have to pay them. But the payment isn't going to be that isn't going to be your primary stumbling block. It's going to be, are you doing anything interesting with it? Which is part of why the leadership question is so important. But, but I know where you're going with this. You're going to say that you got to be the biggest company in the universe, because I read your blog post, right? You got to be a big company in order to play in this space. And I think that there will be room for talented analysts who want to solve interesting problems working with less than giant organizations who have interesting piles of data. It's going to come down to your ability to amass an interesting pile of data, and granting your analysts the freedom to explore useful insights. It's going to be that matchup between the analyst employees' values matching up with the employer's values. Not to get too Jeff Turner on us, we could just channel him in here to say that.
No, I think you're dead right, Gaylord, and what you're talking about is that level of predictive modeling or clairvoyance that really does lead to significant competitive business advantage. It helps you do things like save money with advertising, for example.
Right.
By advertising in smarter, more targeted ways, and you can optimize spends through the use of trend data, and you can say we actually don't need to spend any money in December because nobody's we don't have any open houses, or there's no statistical evidence to show this over the past 10 years, for example. But to your point, Gaylord, I think you're dead right. I think it's not necessarily even like the scale of the data. It's that person's capacity to combine disparate sets of data in meaningful ways for competitive advantage. So it's somebody it's somebody that combines like the weather data with like existing home sales data versus web visitor data and starts to extract predictive meaning out of that says, we should list our houses on these particular days because they're more optimal or something like that, rather than just a sort of scattershot approach.
Hold on a second.
It actually changes your behavior.
But hold on a second. I mean, I guess I have to raise this point. I agree with everything you guys are saying, but it also seems like a truism to me that you can only do those things as an analyst who's motivated to solve these problems, et cetera, if you have the tools. And if big data is one of those tools, and I'm not thinking, I guess what I'm wondering is let's actually
one of the tools required for big data the tools aren't the expensive part. R, which is a great statistical tool, is free. Hadoop and MongoDB and all of the others, data stacks. We're not talking about expensive tools here.
I guess what I consider to be expensive though is not it's not the actual code of Hadoop database, right? I mean, that's not what I consider to be expensive. What I consider to be expensive is the technical knowledge to run those things, number one. And number two, and the bigger piece is having the data.
Yeah.
If you don't have the data, if you don't have access to the big data, then you're not big data, you're small data, right? And your analysts...
You don't need to have it or own it, but you need to have access to it.
You need to have access to it, correct.
And then when you're talking about having access to that, then you're talking about financial consequences of that. Licensing, you're talking about, things like that.
That's exactly right. And all I'm then going back is, so the issue then becomes the one of, what Philip Evans was really talking about, right? And to be clear about this, Gaylord, if you're disagreeing with Evans, that's a different conversation, I guess. And I'm personally really interested to have that conversation. It's a fascinating one. Because what he's essentially saying is, given these constraints and given the power and the competitive advantage that smart deployment of this sort of thing could help, he's really dividing the world between the super large who have access to or are these owners of enormous data sets. And we're not talking real estate and Zillow. I think we're talking Google, Facebook, Foursquare, Verizon with, their billions of, phone calls and, text messages. And we're talking really giant data sets and owners of those data sets. And then the companies that are sizable enough to have access to those things, right? And then at the other extreme end of the unit, from Evans' standpoint, was the individual or the very small team, which makes perfect sense to me. In other words, so applying it down to real estate, let's just say, let's just posit for the sake of discussion that Zillow does become like the dominant big data player. And they have access to the Facebook social graph. They have access to some proprietary data sets at Yahoo that they're paying for. They have access to all sorts of data sets. Right? And they have the talent, the engineers, they have all of those things to just combine it and create this massive data platform. which can do predictive analytics. At that point, I guess the Philip Evans question for me is, does the world that he painted not come into play where you have giant companies, giant big data platforms, and there's individuals? Right? That the group in the middle kind of goes away. Right?
Yeah, well,
in other words, when you...
Yeah, let me jump in on it because I hear what you're saying here. So the one is that I kind of agree with this hollowing trend that you're describing because I see it in many other facets of life at the moment. It's like where you have things on either extreme and whatever it was that was formerly in the middle kind of fades out. And we've kind of discussed some of those before, like in terms of like the number of agents or whatever. But I would say as it applies to big data and the scale of organizations that can be competitive in a future in which, there's predictive analytics are widespread and all that, part of it is how quickly can one of the questions that needs to be worked on is how quickly can you amass a pile of data? So take Foursquare, for example. 5 years ago, they had no data. Now they have a bunch of data, and they were able to do that. They were able to amass a pile of data through an interesting interface delivered through a mobile device. And I think any entrepreneurial organization, as long as any entrepreneurial organization can continue to use that tactic to amass a useful pile of data, then I think that it's not going to be like we're going to switch over to some evil empire or benevolent empire and nothing will ever change. I think that if anything, today it is easier than it ever has been to generate a large pile of data by creating a successful mobile app like Foursquare or any of these other tools that do it. And once you have one significant and useful pile of data, it's almost like patents, right? Once you're Foursquare and you've got this big pile of data, now that's interesting. Now it's going to be suddenly a lot easier for you to negotiate with someone else and say, well, I've got this data and you've got that data, and what do you say we trade it back and forth because we both could do interesting things with it. If it's just you and me saying, okay, well, I've got a brokerage in wherever and I just want to buy some data, then yeah, you're going to need a big pile of money to buy your way in. But if you have something of value to begin with, and note that of value I don't mean money, I mean something that's actually valuable. You're going to get into that conversation easier.
You're talking about unique proprietary data, and how quickly can you ramp up having that, right?
And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that it's not limited to just those with deep pockets.
Absolutely, and there's huge advantage in having your own proprietary data set, of course, because you can monetize it, and then you can, you have. And
it's strategic advantage. Your competitor can't have it.
Strategic advantage of leveraging that, even through, making it available through an API or something like that, as Foursquare and Facebook and Google do. So. It's an interesting sort of time to talk about this kind of stuff as it relates to things like APIs, because a lot of those organizations that you mentioned, like Rob, like the people at the top of that pyramid, like a Facebook, are actually making a lot of that data available for free.
Absolutely.
And that's a really, really interesting thing as it relates to the use and combination of it. So people are starting to do really interesting things by actually just really tapping into the access point of, the close to 1 billion Facebook people that they have, for example, right? Or you tap into like the Google Maps API or, that kind of stuff. And that's the really, really interesting thing. And so you get people making their own services on top of, like the Foursquare API. And what it does is it actually starts to, perpetuate the use of the platform through its own data. And it's a really good brand and marketing use of data. And it's something that I actually don't see too much of in the real estate industry. There's not
absolutely
going on right now.
I could see Zillow pulling that off, though, or Trulia, or, I could see one of those guys doing that. I don't see them doing it today. But.
I could see one of the big two, making an API available so that,
in some ways it makes it into like
other firms build stuff on top of it. Absolutely.
It makes it into like a too big to fail situation. Like that's really the model of the make an API to our unique data set that everyone then builds something on, at which point nobody wants to see you go down because your data set is required for them to make money.
Absolutely. So you see,
and that's,
like
that's
when,
where you get like real advantage.
Right. So when Twitter goes down, everybody freaks out because there's large chunks of the web that also go down with it. Or when, when Tumblr goes down, people's blogs go down. I mean, this is in many ways sort of, it's like a little bit about what Zillow has just done with their $10 website product. That's
absolutely.
the kind of thing that you would make with that kind of API.
Right. I guess what I'm thinking.
We don't know how big that. What we don't know is where that tipping point is, or I guess I think a better phrase would be where that critical mass is. Because you take something like Google Maps, which everybody's building stuff on Google Maps, and then in last year or whatever they raised the price or added a price to using Google Maps, and everyone freaked out, and it was no big deal. Okay, fine, everyone will pay the bill because they're so great. Everyone had assumed they had reached a critical mass where it just wasn't going to matter anymore, and now they could make some money on it. And then we see in the last 3-4 months a pretty large rise in things like the OpenStreetMap project, where people are actively, where companies are migrating out and saying, well, Foursquare is going to go to OpenStreetMaps instead of using the Google API, so now they're using that. And Apple, of course, bought all their own they bought technology to solve that problem. So one of the things is to your original question, Rob, like where is that what's required in terms of critical mass for a real estate organization to say, okay, we've got this thing sewn up. And I'd have to say it would have to be a bigger percentage of the market than Google Maps had of the map thing, because they obviously didn't have that.
Well, I mean, I think the Google Maps thing is interesting. I think the whole Google thing is interesting because I feel like there's sort of this clash of the titans going on at the top of the technology heap, and the rest of us down here are just kind of wondering to see how that's going to resolve itself, right? I mean, in my mind, there's no doubt that Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, I guess, are still somewhat relevant, right? I mean, but let's say those three guys, Google, Apple, and Facebook, to me seem like they are all, battling with each other while at the same time cooperating in certain ways to see who is going to be dominant in the next wave. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Apple decided to abandon Google Maps because of Android, right? Because they see the mobile, as the future, and they want to dominate it. They want to be the standard. So I don't know how that's all going to play out. I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is such a big topic. Hey, get it? Big data, big topic. Anyway, I feel like it's such a big topic, and I feel like we've just begun scratching the surface. I mean, I love the discussion we're having, geeking out over this whole idea of like, what is big data? What does it do? What does it mean? And I love what you just raised, Gaylord. And I think it's something maybe I want to think about tackling in a future podcast. The idea of the tipping point, right? Because here's what I'm kind of imagining, and this is, I guess, why I'm sort of obsessed with it, why I'm fascinated by it, is if Evans is correct, then if one of these organizations, and again, it doesn't have to be the usual suspects. It could be a startup that starts off tomorrow. It could be, Google relaunching its real estate division. It could be anything, where they end up by leveraging both the notion of just enormous horizontal data sets as well as really smart analytics. The question it raises for me is the individual agent, the realtor in the field, that person will never go away. Right? Because when you're dealing with human beings, there's something to that whole sort of, sitting across the dinner table. I mean, that will never go away. But if some of these technology companies are able to drive serious, marketing advantage, really targeted, on point, predictive analytics-driven, type of stuff, I guess I kind of wonder what happens to the rest of the value chain, right? Whether that's the MLS, whether that's a broker, whether it's the franchise. And that's the Evans theory, right, is that all of those people in the middle, they get hollowed out. They no longer have much value because on the one hand you have, Facebook able to deliver incredibly accurate, predictive analytics as to who is going to list their house next, or, this person, should be buying this house next. And on the other hand, you've got the individuals and the very small teams on the ground. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I want to raise that issue, and maybe we could all think about it, because I know we're kind of running low on time here.
I
but
think we could definitely come back to this over and over again. You know, I mean, it's one of those topics that I think won't go away, and it's obviously, I could talk about it for days. So.
I think the notion of how data disintermediates advice is a really, really fascinating one.
That's a good one. So. Listen, well, anyway, gentlemen, we have kind of come to an end. As we didn't get to do it last week, but as I always like to kind of ask each of you guys, what do you think the big story in real estate will be in the coming weeks? Next week, what will we all be talking about? I'm like Gaylord. Gaylord, you go first because you always like to go last.
What are we going to talk about next week? Next week, we're going to be talking about how my team for the National Bike Challenge is totally kicking the butt of my wife's team in the National Bike Challenge.
that would be a big topic in real estate?
That's going to be my real estate topic for next week.
Matthew.
I was actually thinking about this earlier on today, and I think one of the really, really fascinating things to explore next week could be what's going on at the Google I/O conference at the moment. They just did the Google Goggles demo, and they're starting to make that available to their developers. They had this big event where people skydived. They jumped out of a plane, and they were all wearing those Google Goggles shades. And they were all on a hangout together. They were all streaming their skydive live on the web, and then they parachuted into the roof of where the conference was, and then came into the auditorium live, and they were still streaming and everything. So there's that that's coming out of Google I/O, and they're starting to roll out the first set of their Android at Home products, which is really, really fascinating. Sort of future of electrical things in your house, whether that's your refrigerator or your lighting or your, things that you wouldn't traditionally think that would include the web. So think of like everything electrical in your kitchen, for example, is going to start to have the web in it, and Google is starting to roll out hardware solutions to include those kind of things.
Wow.
I think this is like a really fascinating set of things that's going on. As much as people like to sort of talk about Google's lack of share and a competitive attrition from Apple and Facebook, the kinds of things that they're doing are really kind of mind-blowing at times, I think.
Yeah, that's. I mean, they're you know what it is? Google is like the Bell Labs of today. Right?
Yeah. I
mean, back in the 60s and 70s, Bell Labs was the fount of innovation. I mean, I feel like Google Labs and Google in general is totally that. I think, for myself, the next week, what are we going to talk about in real estate? I don't know. I'm guaranteed to be wrong, so I think we're going to be talking about the collapse of the European monetary system, and as a result, how mortgage rates just spiked up to 12%. I don't know, but that's going to be my guess. Guaranteed to be wrong. So.
Predictive analytics from Rob Hahn.
Yes, that was not a good use of big data, Rob.
So that's a great use of no data, you see. Right? You can do really, smart-sounding analytics based on no data. I pulled it out of thin air. Anyway, all right, gentlemen, it's a pleasure as always, and I will speak to you guys next week.
Bye-bye.